Boeing spent $2 billion to avoid building a new aircraft. That shortcut killed 346 people, cost over $20 billion in fines and compensation, and triggered the longest grounding in aviation history. The 737 MAX was supposed to be a cheap solution to beat Airbus. Instead, it became a criminal fraud case, and it destroyed Boeing's century-old legacy. How did the world's most trusted aircraft manufacturer choose profit over lives? Let's walk through the wreckage. To understand how Boeing made this catastrophic choice, we need to go back to the company's roots. Because Boeing was not always driven by spreadsheets and shortcuts. For decades, Boeing was not just an aircraft manufacturer. It was an engineering cathedral. The company that built the 707, the plane that made jet travel accessible. The 747 jumbo jet that shrank the planet. The 777, still considered one of the safest aircraft ever built. Boeing's culture was simple. Engineers made the decisions, and the business followed. If it was not safe, it did not fly. If it was not excellent, it did not ship. But in 1997, everything changed. Boeing merged with McDonnell Douglas, and on paper, Boeing was the buyer. In reality, the McDonnell Douglas management culture took over. The headquarters moved from Seattle, where the planes were built, to Chicago, where the spreadsheets were. Executives who had never designed an aircraft started making engineering decisions based on quarterly earnings targets. The engineers in Seattle, the people who actually understood how aluminum and physics worked, became cost centers to be managed rather than experts to be trusted. Boeing veterans later described it as a cultural infection. The finance mentality had taken over. By 2010, Boeing had a problem, and its name was Airbus. Their European rival launched the A320neo, a re-engined, fuel-efficient version of their best-selling narrow-body aircraft. Airlines were excited. United, American, and Southwest started placing orders with Airbus. Boeing faced a choice that would define the next decade. Option 1. Design a clean-sheet aircraft. Build a brand-new plane from scratch with modern aerodynamics, advanced materials, and next-generation systems. It would take 10 to 15 years and cost $15 to $20 billion. It would be the right aircraft, the safe aircraft, the Boeing way. Option 2. Strap bigger, more fuel-efficient engines onto the 50-year-old 737 airframe, skip the expensive development cycle, and get it to market fast. It would cost around $2 to $3 billion and take less than 5 years. The finance team did the math, and the engineers' objections did not fit in the Excel model. Wall Street wanted quarterly earnings, shareholders wanted dividends, executives wanted stock options to vest. So Boeing chose speed over safety, cost-cutting over engineering integrity, and short-term profit over long-term reputation. They chose the shortcut. That $2 billion decision to re-engineer the old 737, instead of spending $15 billion on a new aircraft, would end up destroying everything. That shortcut would eventually cost over $20 billion and 346 lives. The problem with strapping giant engines onto a 50-year-old airframe is that physics does not care about your earnings call. The 737 was designed in the 1960s with small engines that fit neatly under the wing. The MAX's engines were massive, fuel-efficient turbofans that were too big for the original design. Boeing had to mount them higher and farther forward on the wing. This changed the aircraft's aerodynamics. Under certain flight conditions, the nose could pitch up dangerously, potentially causing an aerodynamic stall that could kill everyone on board. A real aircraft manufacturer would have redesigned the airframe. Boeing installed a software patch. They created MCAS, the Maneuvering Characteristics Augmentation System, a program that would automatically push the nose down if sensors detected a stall risk. It was a band-aid over a bullet wound, and here's where the cost-cutting became criminal. Boeing did not properly disclose how the system worked to pilots or regulators. MCAS was buried deep in technical manuals. Boeing convinced the FAA that it was such a minor system that pilots did not need simulator training. Why? Because mandatory simulator training would mean airlines could demand price concessions. It would mean the MAX was not just a simple upgrade from older 737s. It would mean admitting they had built a fundamentally different, more dangerous aircraft, so they minimized it. Pilots got iPad-based training before flying a plane with a hidden system that could overpower them and force the nose down. Boeing knew this created risks. The FAA, which had delegated much of its certification authority to Boeing itself, did not push back hard enough. Boeing employees had effectively been deputized as FAA safety inspectors. They were certifying their own aircraft. By 2017, Boeing looked like they had pulled off the strategy perfectly. The 737 MAX had over 5,000 aircraft on order, worth more than $600 billion. Southwest, Ryanair, United, and airlines around the world wanted the fuel-efficient jet. Boeing stock climbed above $340 per share. CEO Dennis Muilenburg was praised as a strategic leader who had outmaneuvered Airbus. The company that had taken the shortcut was being rewarded with a market valuation exceeding $150 billion. At company events, executives celebrated. They had beaten Airbus without the massive expense of a clean sheet design. They had protected margins, hit delivery targets, and enriched shareholders. The engineers in Seattle who had raised concerns about MCAS, about the single sensor design, about inadequate pilot training, those engineers were marginalized. Some were reassigned, others left Boeing in frustration. The people who actually built planes had become obstacles to the people who managed stock prices. But even during this apparent victory, problems were surfacing. Pilots were noticing something wrong. In the first year of MAX operations, there were multiple incidents where MCAS activated unexpectedly, forcing the nose down while pilots fought for control. These near misses were reported. Boeing issued bulletins, essentially troubleshooting guidance, but still did not fully explain MCAS or its power over the aircraft. The FAA did not mandate additional training or modifications. Meanwhile, Boeing was in full production mode. They were delivering aircraft as fast as possible. Suppliers were pressured. Assembly line workers faced schedule demands. Internal emails later leaked to investigators revealed shocking attitudes. One message thread had employees describing the MAX as designed by clowns, supervised by monkeys. Another email chain mocked regulators. One Boeing employee wrote, "Would you put your family on a MAX simulator-trained aircraft? I would not." These were not isolated complaints. This was institutional knowledge that corners had been cut, and Boeing kept delivering MAX jets to airlines worldwide. October 29, 2018. Lion Air Flight 610 departed Jakarta, Indonesia, bound for Pangkal Pinang. On board were 189 passengers and crew. 13 minutes after takeoff, they would all be dead. Shortly after leaving the ground, the pilots found themselves in a fight they could not understand. MCAS had activated based on a faulty angle of attack sensor, a sensor Boeing had made non-redundant to save costs. The system incorrectly thought the plane was approaching a stall and started forcing the nose down repeatedly. The pilots pulled back on the controls. MCAS pushed down. They manually adjusted the trim. MCAS pushed down again. 21 times the pilots fought the system. 21 times they tried to counteract forces from a system they did not even know existed, because Boeing had hidden it from training materials. The cockpit voice recorder captured their confusion and growing desperation as they tried everything in their training. Nothing worked. MCAS was overpowering their inputs. The nose kept pitching downward. At 6:33 a.m. local time, the 737 MAX plunged into the Java Sea at over 400 miles per hour. The impact was catastrophic. Everyone on board was killed instantly. Boeing's response was immediate and defensive. Blame the pilots, blame Lion Air's maintenance. Suggest that the airline's training was inadequate. The chief executive officer, Dennis Muilenburg, defended the MAX's safety record in media interviews while Boeing's communications team worked to frame the crash as an isolated incident caused by maintenance issues and crew performance, not a design flaw. They issued guidance about runaway stabilizer trim procedures, still not fully explaining MCAS or its capabilities, still not grounding the fleet or mandating comprehensive training. The FAA, staffed partly by former Boeing employees and dependent on industry cooperation in its certification processes, did not ground the planes. European regulators did not ground them, China did not ground them, and Boeing kept delivering 737 MAXs to airlines around the world, knowing that the same system that had just killed 189 people was installed on every single aircraft coming off the production line. This was the moment Boeing's cost-cutting became unforgivable. They had the evidence. They knew MCAS could activate based on a single faulty sensor. They knew pilots were not properly trained on the system. They knew the forces MCAS could exert were strong enough to overpower manual pilot inputs. They knew another crash was not just possible, but probable unless changes were made. They made a calculated decision. Grounding the fleet would cost billions in immediate losses, airline compensation, and reputational damage. Better to minimize the first crash, issue limited guidance, and hope the problem would not repeat. Internally, Boeing executives focused heavily on financial implications. Emails later obtained by congressional investigators showed managers discussing how to minimize costs, how to avoid mandatory simulator training requirements that would upset airline customers, and how to manage regulators. Some email discussions debated whether to provide more complete MCAS information to the FAA. The answer was often no. Boeing employees expressed confidence that regulators would not require significant additional actions. This was not negligence through ignorance. This was calculated risk management that prioritized financial considerations. Engineers in Seattle were alarmed. Some wrote internal warnings about the need to ground the fleet or mandate training specific to MCAS. Those warnings did not reach senior decision-makers or were dismissed. The finance-focused leadership in Chicago had made their choice, and Wall Street was not punishing them for it. The stock remained strong. Deliveries continued on schedule. Earnings projections were met. From a purely short-term financial perspective, Boeing's approach seemed to be working. Until March 10, 2019. Ethiopian Airlines Flight 3002 departed Addis Ababa at 8:38 a.m. local time, bound for Nairobi, Kenya. The captain was experienced, well-trained, and crucially aware of the Lion Air crash. He had studied Boeing's guidance bulletins. He understood the runaway trim procedures. He was as prepared as any pilot could be. 6 minutes after takeoff, he and everyone else on board were dead. The scenario was nearly identical to Lion Air. A faulty angle of attack sensor triggered MCAS. The system began forcing the nose down. The pilots recognized the problem almost immediately and followed Boeing's emergency procedures exactly as written. They disabled the electric trim system just as the guidance instructed. But Boeing's procedures were inadequate. With electric trim disabled, the pilots had to manually crank the stabilizer trim wheel to raise the nose, a wheel that becomes extremely difficult to turn at high speeds and with significant aerodynamic forces. The cockpit voice recorder captured the captain and first officer straining with physical effort, trying to turn the manual trim wheel as the plane accelerated toward the ground. They briefly re-engaged electric trim to try to relieve some of the extreme forces, and MCAS immediately reactivated, slamming the nose back down with full authority. The first officer's final words included, "Pull up." The captain was pulling as hard as physically possible. It did not matter. The aerodynamic forces were too extreme. At 8:44 a.m., the 737 MAX impacted the ground outside Bishoftu, Ethiopia, at over 500 miles per hour. The aircraft disintegrated. All 157 people on board were killed. The crash site was so catastrophic that some victims' families received no recoverable remains. This time, the global response was immediate. Within 3 days, aviation regulators across the world grounded the entire 737 MAX fleet. China acted first, grounding all MAX aircraft on March 11th. European authorities followed, then country after country. The FAA, facing intense criticism and international pressure, finally grounded all U.S.-registered 737 MAX aircraft on March 13th. 2019, Boeing's stock collapsed, falling more than 25% over the following weeks. But the financial damage was just beginning. The grounding lasted 20 months, the longest in modern commercial aviation history. Boeing hemorrhaged cash. MAX production was halted, then severely reduced. Airlines demanded hundreds of millions of dollars in compensation for grounded aircraft they could not use. Suppliers faced bankruptcy. Boeing's entire supply chain was disrupted. But worse than the immediate financial impact was what investigators uncovered: the truth about what Boeing had known and when they had known it. The Department of Justice launched a criminal investigation. Congress opened aggressive oversight hearings. Internal documents were subpoenaed, and what investigators found was damning. Boeing had deliberately withheld critical information about MCAS from the FAA during certification. They had understated how often the system could activate and how much force it could exert. They had pressured the FAA to avoid mandatory simulator training requirements. Internal communications revealed employees mocking safety concerns and regulators. Messages that said, "Designed by clowns, supervised by monkeys," became public. Other messages showed employees joking about fooling the FAA. Congressional hearings in late 2019 were brutal. Dennis Muilenburg was called before both the House and the Senate, where he sat facing families of crash victims and attempted to explain why Boeing had valued cost savings over their loved ones' lives. His testimony was evasive. He apologized in vague terms, discussed process improvements, but refused to accept clear, personal responsibility. It was corporate crisis management at its worst. In December 2019, Boeing's board finally fired Dennis Muilenburg. His exit package was reportedly over $60 million. 346 people remained dead. Boeing's financial reckoning was severe. The company eventually paid over $20 billion across multiple categories, a $2.5 billion settlement with the Department of Justice that included a criminal fraud charge for deceiving regulators about MCAS, $500 million to compensate airlines, additional settlements to victims' families, and billions more in lost orders, production disruptions, and compensation to airline customers. The price of the shortcut exceeded the cost of building a clean-sheet aircraft from scratch multiple times over. The decision that was supposed to save money became the most expensive mistake in Boeing's history. But not a single executive went to prison. Not one. Boeing paid fines and made promises to reform. That's how corporate accountability works when you are considered too important to truly punish. You can cause 346 deaths through calculated cost cutting, and if you are large enough, you write checks and move forward. New Chief Executive Officer David Calhoun took over in January 2020, promising cultural transformation and a return to engineering-focused decision-making. Boeing redesigned the maneuvering characteristics augmentation system, called MCAS, to require input from 2 angle-of-attack sensors instead of 1. The company mandated MAX-specific simulator training for all pilots worldwide. It submitted to the most intensive recertification process in aviation regulatory history. The 737 MAX was finally cleared to return to service in November 2020, nearly 2 years after the global grounding began. But the damage to Boeing's reputation and market position was permanent. Airlines that had ordered hundreds of jets canceled orders or indefinitely deferred deliveries. Southwest Airlines, historically Boeing's most loyal customer and an all-737 operator, began purchasing Airbus aircraft for the first time in the company's history. Ryanair publicly criticized Boeing for delivery delays and quality problems. The $600 billion order backlog that had seemed unstoppable in 2017 evaporated. Airbus surpassed Boeing as the world's largest commercial aircraft manufacturer by deliveries, a position Boeing had held for decades. The competitive advantage Boeing had sacrificed safety to protect was gone, and because Boeing apparently couldn't stop compounding their disasters, new problems kept emerging. In January 2024, an Alaska Airlines 737 MAX 9 had a door plug blow out mid-flight at 16,000 feet. Passengers were exposed to explosive decompression. It was only extraordinary luck that no one was killed or sucked out of the aircraft. The FAA immediately grounded all MAX 9 aircraft for emergency inspections. Investigators discovered that multiple aircraft had improperly installed or completely missing bolts on door plug assemblies. Boeing's quality control processes, years after the crashes, were still fundamentally broken. The company that had once defined aerospace manufacturing excellence was now delivering aircraft with critical fasteners missing or improperly secured. Whistleblowers began coming forward in unprecedented numbers. Current and former Boeing employees testified to Congress and spoke to media about systematic quality control failures, inspection records being falsified, and a workplace culture that punished people who raised safety concerns. One whistleblower, John Barnett, a quality manager with over 30 years at Boeing, provided detailed testimony about manufacturing defects being deliberately concealed and inspectors being pressured to approve work that did not meet standards. On March 9, 2024, Barnett was found dead in his truck in a hotel parking lot in Charleston, South Carolina. Authorities ruled it a self-inflicted gunshot wound. He had been in Charleston giving deposition testimony in his whistleblower lawsuit against Boeing. The timing raised questions. Boeing denied any involvement. The circumstances remain controversial. Today, Boeing is a diminished version of what it once was. The legacy Boeing spent a century building was shattered by a $2 billion shortcut. The commercial aircraft division that once generated reliable profits is now a reputational disaster zone. The 737 MAX eventually returned to service, but many pilots privately express reservations about the aircraft. Passengers check their booking details and try to avoid MAX flights when possible. Airlines quietly shift future orders toward Airbus when contracts permit. Boeing's defense division faces its own crisis, hemorrhaging money on fixed-price military contracts. The Starliner spacecraft program has been plagued with failures. The KC-46 tanker program is billions over budget and years behind schedule. The company that represented American aerospace dominance for generations is now a case study in what happens when financial management destroys engineering culture. Boeing's stock price has significantly underperformed broader market indices for years. The company has conducted multiple rounds of layoffs. Key suppliers have reduced their dependence on Boeing or exited relationships entirely. Boeing's reputation in the global aerospace industry is severely damaged. Airbus is winning market share in virtually every category. And perhaps most tellingly, when aviation professionals and aerospace engineers are asked privately, many admit they would not choose to fly on a 737 MAX if alternatives were available, and they would not want their families on those aircraft either. That's the ultimate vote of no confidence. When the people who build and maintain aircraft do not trust the aircraft, the game is over. 346 people are still dead. The families who lost loved ones received financial settlements, but no one received justice. Not a single Boeing executive faced criminal prosecution. Dennis Muilenburg left Boeing with over $60 million. The finance-focused managers who pushed for shortcuts, who ignored engineering warnings, who prioritized quarterly earnings over human lives, retired comfortably with their stock options and incentive compensation vested. They are living well while passengers still board 737 MAX aircraft, wondering if today's flight will be the one where another sensor fails or another bolt is missing. The Boeing 737 MAX is the definitive case study in what happens when financial optimization overrules engineering judgment. It is what happens when a company forgets that, in aviation, there is zero margin for error. It is what happens when executives who have never designed an aircraft decide they understand safety better than the engineers who have spent careers making aircraft safe. Boeing believed they could cut the $2 billion cost of proper aircraft development. They believed they could hide a powerful flight control system from pilots. They believed they could blame foreign airlines when their design killed people. They believed they were too big, too important, too deeply embedded in American manufacturing to face real accountability. They were wrong about everything except the last part. They were too big and too politically connected to be held truly accountable. Boeing survived. The executives walked away wealthy, and the only people who paid the full price were 346 passengers and crew members who boarded flights, trusting that a plane with Boeing's name on it was safe, because that name had meant something for over 100 years. It had meant engineering excellence, uncompromising safety standards, American innovation at its absolute best. Now it means cost-cutting, regulatory capture, and corporate decisions that killed hundreds of people, all wrapped in patriotic rhetoric about American manufacturing. In the long run, safety is not a cost to be managed or optimized. It is the entire foundation of aviation. If you cannot build a safe aircraft, you have no business building aircraft at all. And if you deliberately build a dangerous aircraft, hide the dangers from the people who have to fly it, and then blame them when they die, you do not deserve to survive as a company. Boeing survived anyway because of its political connections and importance to U.S. manufacturing. But the trust is gone. The legacy is broken. And in aviation, trust and legacy are everything. If you want to see more investigations into how financial arrogance destroyed iconic companies, tap through to one of the videos here. And if you are flying soon, check your boarding pass carefully. If it says 737 MAX, you are boarding the aircraft that killed 346 people because Boeing executives chose a $2 billion shortcut over doing it right.